You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
We have a reoccurring theme on the show where we talk about ethics. Now, for those listeners that haven't listened to any of our previous episodes or panel shows on ethics, I urge you to go back and listen to them, because what you'll find is we're developing a very similar discussion point on what is important in terms of the ethical conduct of military operations. How do soldiers conduct themselves during war? What makes a good military leader? And how do they make ethical decisions? G'day listeners, and welcome to the Dead Prussian podcast. I'm your host Mick, and I want to thank two listeners in particular. Tim, a new-time listener, thanks for the feedback, and also a long-term listener, Andrew, you know who you are. Thanks very much for listening to the show. I'd also like to thank all of our Patreon supporters. You're doing a fantastic job, and hopefully you're enjoying the bonus question for each episode. Please feel free to jump in and comment and talk to me about the exclusive content you're being provided. Let me know if you want more. And for those people that don't know what I'm talking about, go to patreon.com/thedeadprussian. Sign up. It'll cost you a little bit of tin each month, but you get a little bit more from each episode than the average listener. Not that any of my listeners are average. Now, I talked a little bit about ethics in the intro, and it was a bit of a different intro because we've had a bit of discussion about ethics on the show before. Now, it's not a boring topic. It's actually a very interesting topic, and we're taking it in a different direction today, which is good. A positive direction, though, which is even better. Now, my guest today is Dr. David Whetham. David is a professor of ethics and the military profession in the Defence Studies Department of King's College London, and all my listeners should know them pretty well. They helped the show get off to a great start, actually, in some of our earlier episodes. And that's based at the Joint Services Command and Staff College at the United Kingdom Defence Academy. David's main research interests are focused on the ethical dimensions of warfare, the development of the laws of war, and how these ideas are best communicated within professional military education, another theme you have tracked on the show, listeners. He is the director of the King's Centre for Military Ethics, established in 2015 with the aim of conducting research into military ethics in order to develop and promote best practice in its education and application. In 2009, David was a visiting fellow with the Centre for Defence Leadership and Ethics at the Australian Defence College in Canberra, a lovely city. And in spring 2011, David was a resident fellow at the Vice Admiral James B. Stockdale, which is an excellent rank and name combination, Centre for Ethical Leadership at the US Naval Academy, Annapolis. From November 2014 to 2016, David was a visiting fellow at the University of Glasgow, conducting ESRC-funded research into moral victories, ethics, exit strategies, and the ending of wars. In 2014, David was commissioned by the British Military Advisory and Training Team in Nigeria to produce a report on the current provision of military ethics in the different officer training and education institutions in Kaduna and Abuja. Now, I haven't checked the spelling with anyone on that. You're just going to have to take me for granted on how that's pronounced. And also, part of this project was learning how to engage in capacity building in this area. Now, from 2012 onwards, David has contributed to an international team of military ethicists assisting the Colombian War College, introducing military ethics into the Corps Officer curriculum. In 2016, this involved working with senior leadership on the implementation of the peace agreement with the help of the PLUS Alliance. I'm going to assume that's a Plus Alliance. Partners at the University of New South Wales, my alma mater. Proof that they love good work and excellent students. Now, this was a bespoke blended learning military ethics curriculum, and it will go live for the Colombian War College this year. So that's a lot, listeners, but what I think we can understand is that there's a lot of places out there that are very much interested in this sort of stuff. And David, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Mick, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to finally be able to join you.
And for listeners that don't know, I think I started asking David 12 months ago, and then I got really slack. There's a few people out there who listen to the show that probably have some invites waiting from me to respond to. So we're very lucky to have him. But before we just start discussing a new book that David was a co-editor on called Military Virtues. I actually want to understand a little bit more about how you got started in this particular business. So are you able to tell our listeners a little bit about how you started studying and writing on military ethics?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I did an undergraduate degree in philosophy, so I consider myself to be a philosopher. I was particularly interested in political philosophy, and that morphed into international relations. So the jump from philosophy to war studies wasn't actually as extreme as it might appear, according to the CV. The bit I was particularly interested in when I moved across to King's to do my master's was this strange idea that when all the normal rules are broken down and you're in a situation of conflict, and yet at the same time new rules apply, and those rules seem to have been fairly consistently applied across history. So it's this strange paradox. I didn't get all the answers out of my MA, so I carried on and did my PhD in the ethics of war at King's, and that led me on to, very fortunately, King's College at around about that time was expanding its contract of supporting the Joint Services Command and Staff College in the UK. So they were looking for somebody who could look at the normative angle. So I was very fortunate to join the team there out in 2003. And I know some of my colleagues have already been on the show before me, like Hugh Davies and Amy Fox and David Morgan Owens. So it's a very large and extremely capable team, and it's superb to be part of it. There's lots of chances to engage worldwide from there and try and make a difference, which for me as a philosopher is what it's all about. It's very hard to actually make a practical impact on the world as a philosopher writing obscure journal articles on epistemology. But military ethics, there's a lot of moral philosophers out there who don't like engaging in the world of war and conflict because it's, well, understandably unpleasant. But I think a lot of them are missing a trick there, because it's a huge missed opportunity if you're going to ignore this incredibly rich environment for exploring extreme moral realities and moral situations and exploring those ethical challenges and trying to support the people that we place in those situations with the tools and the knowledge to make the most appropriate decision possible when those situations arise.
Now, I just want to make it clear for all our listeners that we have previously had some of David's colleagues on the show, but we definitely save the best for last. And also, I think there's a lesson in David's journey for all those people that have philosophy degrees but no jobs. Start researching war, because it sounds like there's actually a market for people in this area, which is good to know, because it's a serious topic, and we kind of need some guidance with the moral philosophy side of things, because it helps us understand war's impact on society, which is what the show is all about. Now, absolutely.
And I think it's really important to understand. And when I started out, my job didn't exist, and now there's so much demand domestically and internationally for people who can really navigate ethical decision making, this realm. That yes, you certainly won't be short of work, and we could do with some more colleagues working in this area, definitely.
And I think just the fact that this show, this is a small production, but we're able to run a theme on military ethics because there's so many people like yourself out there, David, of high quality philosophers that are getting involved in it. In fact, you gathered a few of them together to help you write a book, or you co-edited it with a couple of colleagues. And from what my understanding is, the book Military Virtues covers a virtue per chapter, and you've had a military ethicist write a chapter in each thing. Is this right? Can you provide us a little bit of a background on the book? Because I've probably just done a terrible job of giving the listeners an understanding of it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that was it was a good start. So The book I co-edited with Dr. Mike Skirker who's a professor at the US Naval Academy in Annapolis, and Don Carrick, who's had a long history of interest in professional military ethics education. He's contributed and co-edited volumes that many of your readers will already be familiar with, like Ethics Education in the Military, and the series of books that followed along the same themes. And then myself, we were approached by the publisher, Kirsten Howgate, to try and do something a little bit different, which was write for military professionals rather than at them, when we were going to look at military ethics. So the book does have some superb moral philosophers contributing to the chapters, but it's also got a huge number of practitioners, so it's not just academics. So there's lots of useful practical experience and case studies that comes out throughout the volume. But that practical experience, it's much more than simply a collection of anecdotes, because every chapter is robustly framed, and so that each virtue has got a focus on the military profession, so that every contribution stays on target.
And when we talk about military virtues, do we mean, I guess this may be a gross simplification, but that's kind of what I'm here to do. I'm here to be the gross one. Do we mean the definable character traits that make military leaders great? What are we talking about in terms of these virtues?
It's a really good question. Virtue ethics, the virtue ethics model is or pretty much universally relied upon by professional militaries around the world as part of the character formation of their personnel. So we're talking honesty, bravery, etc. These things that must be practiced by competent professionals. And so different militaries around the world recognize that there's different ways of doing this, but the most effective ways involve things like using role models. So the Royal Navy, for example, has the Nelsonian tradition. So if you're in doubt, then what would Nelson do is normally a pretty good idea. So role models are important. We have pictures up on the walls in officers' messes that give you examples of who you should be aspiring to be like, and we know the characters of the people from history that are remembered for the right reasons. That virtue model also relies upon developing good habits. So it's not just about emulating role models, it's about doing it. It's about forming your moral character. The idea being that if you can form your moral character, then it represents a sort of a stable disposition. You can predict how people will behave when tested, if they have developed their moral character in an appropriate way. And the best way to do this is by practicing it, by actually doing it. If you want people to be honest, they need to practice being honest. If you want people to be courageous, they need to practice being brave. And this is why around the world you have the statements of these of virtues that people think are required in different military organizations and institutions to get the most out of their people. So I think it might be worth, there's definitely some methodological, even terminological confusion between this idea of virtues and values, and they're often mixed up. And when we're talking about virtues, what we're talking about is those desirable internalized characteristics, such as courage, that people will be able to demonstrate bravery because they have the virtue of courage. And then values, which are very closely related to that. These represent the ideals that the community itself cherishes. So one of those values in our book of military virtues is professionalism, for example. And there is a chapter, a very interesting exploration of this tension between virtues and values in the book. But what we're mostly focused upon is how these virtues translate into exactly the type of professional behavior that means that military professionals are the most effective that they possibly can be in their environment. I mean, according to the Greeks, we've got the cardinal virtues, of course: prudence,
Yeah.
justice, temperance, courage. And we understand these. And we've added to these with values and virtues that we've identified with our contributors, our moral philosophers and our practitioners, experienced practitioners. We've added to these loyalty and obedience, wisdom, integrity, honesty, perseverance, discipline, compassion, humility, patience, and that final one, professionalism. And altogether they make up this, the different chapters in the volume, each chapter being set up with an overview, and then case studies and the practical experience of the practitioners brought out to illustrate what this virtue looks like or can look like in practice, and also the dangers of getting it wrong and sometimes getting it right, of course.
And I noticed two of my strongest and most notable traits of arrogance and hubris aren't actually listed. So I might have to rethink which virtues I put forward. But so if I've got this correct, and feel free to tell me if I don't. Most of the guests are very quick to do that. The virtues of a military leader and these values, they should resonate with the ethical values and of the society they serve. Is this right?
I think this is a very important thing to recognise, but also to understand that the questions, it's a lot deeper than that, which is what you'd expect with the dead Prussian.
It's philosophy, right?
Absolutely. So you can have the idea that different countries will have different virtues or values that they will particularly aspire to or champion isn't perhaps that extraordinary. But if you have a look, even within countries, you can have different virtues and values being promoted by different services. So, for example, in the UK, we've got the Royal Navy champion commitment, courage, discipline, respect for others, integrity and loyalty, whereas the Royal Air Force focus on their acronym RISE, so respect, integrity, service before self and excellence. Now, on the face of it, that sounds very, very different. It sounds like very different values or virtue statements. But actually, when you push them a bit further, and unpack those ideas and what they're actually trying to get at, then you realise that they're not saying anything particularly different at all. So for the RAF, for example, that service before self value, that virtue there, that actually includes the idea of physical courage and loyalty and commitment and teamwork. So once you unpack the headline, you realise that they're trying to get to exactly the same thing, but put their own spin on it to give their own organisational cultural twist, if you like. And you can see why countries will do exactly the same. So these virtues don't actually vary very much across the different international military professional forces around the world. They might use different words, but they're trying to do the same thing. But you can see how local flavour or national flavour will influence the way those virtues and values are expressed. So, for example, the work that I've been doing in Colombia for the last few years, it's very important to understand the influence of the Roman Catholic Church on the way that people frame problems. And if you want your professional military ethics education to work, then understanding that this is the way that people are brought up and programmed to think of ethical challenges is very important if you want to get the most out of your training and education programs. And different values, different virtues will manifest themselves slightly differently in different cultures. For example, I've been working for the last few years with my opposite numbers in the People's Liberation Army in China. So they actually do have military ethicists there as well. And sometimes we're even looking at the same things. But when you're looking at the way that different virtues manifest themselves, things like, for example, obedience, that has a slightly different flavour in the People's Liberation Army than it might in Norway, for example. China doesn't have any culture of challenging or questioning orders from a higher authority. So on the face of it, that virtue, if that is a military virtue that you should be aspiring to, doesn't belong it looks extremely different. But even there, if you explore it further, when you understand what you're supposed to be being obedient to and the higher purposes that you are being motivated towards pursuing, you realize that even in this example, the difference isn't so extreme as it might first appear. But you have to understand local context. You have to understand local flavor if you want your ethics education and training programs to work in more than one place. So absolutely, it is important to understand local flavor and local differences.
It's I just can't get past the acronym RISE, Service Before Self. That's RISBS. Like, come on, Raf, you're cheating the people there by giving yourself a few extra words in your acronym. I'm an acronym watcher for those listeners that don't know. Doesn't come out that often on the show, but acronyms, acrostic poems. Acrostic poems seem to be the most common way for people to express values in value-based organisations. We call them acronyms or value statements these days in modern organisations, but when we were children at school, they were called acrostic poems, and that's still what I call them. Look, so understanding all that, I guess because you're one of the editors, and I want to pit you against your authors, the people who have so willingly contributed to this work. Which of the military virtues described in the book is the most important?
Well, that's like asking me which one of my kids is my favorite.
Well, that's the next question.
I think in this, it's much like the same problem. You can't choose one virtue as being more important than the others, because any virtue taken in isolation or at the expense of the others means that you're not going to be the rounded professional that you need to be in this environment. So we think that actually you've got to get all of these right. You need to engage with all of them and think about how you put them into practice and strive to make them part of your personal and professional identity. So yeah, no one said it's easy, but I don't think you can take any of them in isolation.
I don't think I have any of them in isolation anyway. But that's a very diplomatic answer there, David. I wasn't able to bait you on it, but that's okay. I'll think of something more difficult to ask you after we do the bonus question, which is for our subscribers who support the show through Patreon. So for our other listeners, we'll just have a quick pause. Now, David, our final question, or I guess my final question, because I'm the star of the show. My final question is one I ask all guests. It actually relates to our mission on the show to define war in as many ways as possible, just like the real star of the show, Big Carl, the dead Prussian himself. This is part of our mission to continue the ongoing and very important discussion about war and its relationship to society. So I ask each question. I don't ask each question to finish anything. I ask guests to finish sentences, actually. And I'm asking you to finish the sentence war is. So, David, can you please finish the sentence war is?
Always the result of failure.
Oh, brilliant. Brilliant. I'd clap, but I'd wake up everyone who lives around TDP Studios. That is brilliant. Do you want to expand?
The just war tradition obviously tells us that war is always should be a last resort. Sometimes it might be a regrettable necessity, but it's always a tragedy if you have to embark on it. But the point is, if you've got to this stage, then so many things have failed to stop you from getting to that point already. It's a massive failure of leadership, of people, of politics. And although it might be the continuation of policy by other means, it's also, as a result, the failure of the policy up to that point. So I think recognizing it as a failure is an important starting point.
That's excellent. I'll also note that my listeners, might not be too happy with me because I'm always criticising other guests for not being succinct. I get a guest with a succinct answer, and then encourage a moral philosopher to expound upon their answer, which is always fraught with danger, much like what we've been discussing this evening here and this afternoon there where you are. Now, David, I'd love to sit here and chat ethics all night with you, and provide our listeners with as much brain knowledge from you as we can. But I'm probably going to go to bed. So thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Mick.
Now, listeners, make sure you check out the book Military Virtues. You can find the link in our show notes. It will go through Amazon, who is now our supporter in terms of where we get our kickbacks from for any books you buy through our show notes and show links. We'll also put some links on the website as well. So make sure you check that out through our Amazon links. The money won't come out of David's pocket, so don't worry. Amazon will give us some out of theirs. Now, also, you can check out David on Twitter at David Whetham, and that is David spelt like the way people spell David. It's not usually spelt any other way. And his surname is Whetham. For all of those of us who believe the English language should be simple, it's wet like a whetstone for those people who grew up in the country sharpening their father's knives. Now, please jump on and support us on Patreon. It's been fantastic to see the iTunes reviews popping up online, particularly in the US. Those listeners in the UK, you've always been slack. You always will be slack. So fine, thanks. And the Australians, you can probably pick up your socks a little bit on providing us iTunes reviews. Now, just remember, if you want to leave a bad review, maybe just don't listen to the show. That's easy. I'm happy for that. If you want to leave a positive review, that's great. You don't have to listen to the show, but it's fantastic that you do. But until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at the Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.